Today I'm bringing you my March reading wrap-up, which is also going to include a couple of books that I read in February because I didn't film a February wrap-up. I read 5 books in February and 10 books in March, but in this video I'm not going to be talking about any books that I read for the Reddit Fantasy Bingo Challenge. I filmed a whole separate wrap-up for that, which I will leave linked in the cards and in the description, just in case you missed it if you want to check it out, but I don't want to feel like I'm repeating myself. Sorry, I'm also losing my voice apparently. But yeah, I will leave that video linked if you want to check that out. This video is just going to be focusing on the other books that I read, which is mostly thrillers and literary fiction. There are 8 books, I think, in total that I'm going to be talking about, and we're going to go in order of my least favourite to my favourite, because I did actually read my best book of the year in March, which I'm really excited to talk about. But before then, we need to talk about my biggest disappointment of the year so far, because I also read that in March. Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins is the first book that I've got on my list, and because yeah, unfortunately I didn't like this, and I am so confused because when this came out last year I heard rave reviews. I heard so many people talking about how it was their best book of the year, and so I couldn't imagine a situation where I didn't at least like this. But yeah, it didn't work for me at all, and I think the main issue that I had is that I really struggled to connect to anything that was happening. It was really fast paced, it was really compulsively readable, it kept me turning the page wanting to find out more. It wasn't boring, but that's the only positive thing I really have to say about it. The plot felt like a repeat of other Hunger Games books. It didn't add anything new to the world, in my opinion, compared to the other prequel. Have I said this already? This is a prequel set within the Hunger Games world. I feel like this was such a popular release that most people know that, but I don't feel like this added anything new to the world. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes at least showed the early days of the Hunger Games and how they changed and how they started to look like the Hunger Games that we know from Katniss's story. So even though I had some issues with the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, at least I enjoyed that aspect. But in this, I felt like there was a lot of telling instead of showing. The characters felt just really flat. Even the characters from the previous books that came back into it, it felt like they had no real purpose being there other than for nostalgia. Haymitch had no personality compared to the Haymitch that I remember from the original trilogy. He was kind of being positioned as this older brother type figure, and I don't think it really worked because it felt so forced. The new characters that were introduced barely had any page time, so when these awful things were happening, I felt like I was being told, okay, this horrible thing has happened, Haymitch is now sad, but then we were moving on. I didn't feel like the writing was very emotive. It felt very juvenile to the point where I want to reread the original Hunger Games and the other books in the series to see whether I've misremembered the writing, because I remember the writing in those books. Obviously, like, it's YA. YA doesn't mean badly written, it just means that it's suitable for a teenage audience. Either way, I don't remember the writing in the other books feeling this flat. Honestly, it felt like this book was written to be turned into a movie because I could picture how certain scenes would look on screen, but there were so many plot holes, things that just didn't make any sense within the context of the world that we know. So yeah, I gave it 2 stars. 3 stars felt too generous, but like I said, I do think that it would make a decent movie, so I probably will watch it, and hopefully it works better for me on screen, because as a book, I don't think it did anything particularly well. This next book I also gave 2 stars. However, I have already recommended it to a few of my friends because I don't think it was bad. I think it was just not for me. I think if you like dark psychological thrillers with lots of twists and turns, then Dead in the Water by John Mars could work for you. In this, we are following a guy who at the start of the book has a near-death experience. He almost drowns, and as he's drowning, his life flashes before his eyes. During this time, he sees an image of a boy that he doesn't remember, and when he comes to, he becomes obsessed with trying to work out what he saw. He starts to think maybe he was a witness to a crime that happened that he's blocked from his memory. The lengths that the characters go to was unhinged, and if you know anything about my taste in thrillers, you'll know that if someone describes a book as being unhinged, it puts me off, because I know that I prefer thrillers that are a little more realistic and a bit more grounded in reality. I can suspend my disbelief to a certain extent, but there's a limit where if a book goes past that, then I start to think, okay, this is just getting ridiculous. And I felt like I reached that point with Dead in the Water. I can't remember the last time I read a book that has this many twists and turns, and some of them I didn't see coming. Some of them were a little bit predictable, but honestly there was so many that it would have been impossible for me to see everything come in. The thing is, a lot of the major shocks came from characters being unhinged, and this does have a connection to another John Marrs book, which is difficult to talk about because I happen to have read this other John Marrs book, and when I reached the point in the book where I saw how it was connected, that was actually my favourite thing about the book. So I don't want to tell you because I feel like I would be taking that experience away from you. I don't think it's necessary to have read this other book in order to read this because it is a standalone, it's not a sequel or anything. If you do want to know, I've seen a few people have talked about it on Goodreads in various reviews, or you are welcome to leave me a comment and I'll reply to you individually. I think obviously different people have different opinions on what counts as a spoiler. I'm glad that I didn't know what book it was connected to, but at the same time, I wouldn't have had the same experience if I read this having not read the other book. That was really complicated to try and explain. But yeah, I always say that John Marrs is one of my favourite thriller authors, and I do stand by that. However, I think I need to clarify that it's his sci-fi thrillers that I love because they have social commentary and they're really thought-provoking, whereas his standard thrillers are missing that, and I think that's why I don't enjoy them as much. Next up we have When Justice Sleeps by Stacey Abrams. This is a political thriller that I only finished last night and I gave it 3 stars. I feel like I don't have that much to say about it, but if you enjoy Dan Brown's books or John Grisham's books, I feel like this falls under a similar subgenre. It follows a main character who works for the Department of Justice in the US. She's a clerk. I feel like I don't know how to say that word, but she works for a Supreme Court Justice who is usually the swing vote of the court. However, at the start of the book, he falls into a coma and she finds out that she's been named his legal guardian and power of attorney. He was investigating a conspiracy within the government and she gets roped into following the clues that he's left her to continue this investigation. So yeah, I came across this while I was researching crime and legal thrillers. Apparently Stacey Abrams is a famous politician in the US. Apparently she used to write romances under a pseudonym, and this was her first legal thriller, and it is the first book in a series. I would be open to reading the sequels. I think there's 3 books at the moment, and the most recent book came out last year. I listened to the audiobook, which was fine. I don't feel like it enhanced my experience, but I also don't think I would have enjoyed this more if I'd read it physically. The audiobook was just okay, in my opinion. It was 15 hours long, which I felt like I was reading this for weeks because it did take me a little while to get into it. There was some terminology that I wasn't familiar with, so I kept having to rewind parts to make sure I'd understood. But the ending I thought was impactful. It was a bit dramatic. Some of the villains came across as a bit mustache twirly, which I didn't love, but I think this would also make a pretty good movie. I would watch this if it was a movie, and I would recommend it if it sounds like your kind of thriller. Her Last Breath by Taylor Adams is the next book on my list. This is a fairly new release. It came out on Kindle and audiobook last month. However, I think the physical edition is being published in the UK this month in April. I buddy read this with my partner. This is the second book that we've buddy read together by Taylor Adams. This is the 3rd book that I've read by him, but me and my partner have buddy read his last 2 releases, and I really like how Taylor Adams writes these high adrenaline survival thrillers, and I think he does that really well. This, if you don't know, follows 2 friends who go caving. One is experienced and does a lot of adventure tourism, one isn't, and from the prologue you know that something terrible happened and a rescue team are currently trying to save someone who is trapped in this cave. It was very claustrophobic, very anxiety inducing, and I had a fun time with it. I would have liked a little more of a deep dive into characters' motivations because I feel like that was lacking and you just had to kind of go with it. But this did feel like a proper thrilling thriller, which yeah, I think Taylor Adams does that so well. There was one element which I didn't like, and I can't talk about it because I think it would be considered a spoiler, but the annoying thing is I don't think it contributes anything to the book. It could have been removed or rewritten slightly. I can think of exactly how this particular element could have been rewritten and it wouldn't have been offensive and I did find it a little bit maybe offensive is a strong word, but I really, really hated that it was even a thing because it didn't contribute anything to the book and it really annoyed me. I have talked about this on Goodreads if you want to see my spoiler review, obviously only if you've read the book or you don't care about spoilers. It was so annoying because if that hadn't been in there, then I wouldn't have even questioned giving this 4 stars. At the start of the book, I thought it could be a 5-star thriller, but it fell down for me in the second half, mostly because of this one thing. Next up we have A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum. This is a literary fiction novel that follows the women of a Palestinian family living in America. It starts in the 1990s and ends in the 2010s, and there's a few different characters that you follow, but the first perspective that you're introduced to is Ezra. She is 17 and living in Palestine when she is married to a man who takes her back to New York to live with his family. You also follow Ezra's daughter Dea when she's a teenager and her grandparents are starting to put pressure on her to get married and conform to certain gender roles. So it explores culture and religion and how they are two very different things. It also talks about the immigrant experience, and there are some parts of this book that are really sad and heartbreaking. I gave it 4 stars because the writing was a little simplistic, but I didn't notice it as much listening to the audiobook. I thought the audiobook was really well narrated. Another little issue that I had was I felt like some parts were a bit repetitive. I felt like there were certain conversations between characters that were repeated over and over again. And maybe that was the point to kind of drive home the frustration, but listening to it, it did start to feel a little bit tedious. I have read some reviews that have criticised this for potentially reinforcing certain stereotypes, but I don't feel like that was the author's intention. I've read a few interviews with her where she's spoken about how this was based on her own experiences. It does have content warnings for abuse, so do bear that in mind if you are thinking about picking this one up. But I would recommend it if you're looking for accessible literary fiction because I don't feel like the writing is overly complex. Next up we have Universality by Natasha Brown. This is a very short literary fiction that was nominated for the Book Prize last year. That's how I first heard about it, and it stood out to me among the nominees because first of all I thought the cover was really eye-catching, and I heard that it was about the power of the press and the media. I borrowed this from my library because they had the ebook available and I thought it would be a quick read. It opens with an article that a journalist has written about an event that happened during lockdown in 2021 where a man was hit over the head with a gold bar, and this happened on a farm in Yorkshire. This journalist is trying to unpack the truth behind what happened, and then the rest of the book follows various people, including this journalist, as well as the owner of the gold bar and a controversial author who was also interviewed as part of the investigation. I think the purpose of this book is to commentate on the political landscape of British society today. It talks a lot about class differences, but the main theme is how people use the media to their advantage to control or push a certain narrative. It critiques those who are politically at both ends of the spectrum. The characters who are more left-leaning are portrayed as being more talk than action, and then the more right-wing characters are portrayed as not being very self-aware. But then you also have this fascinating character in the middle who changes her opinion based on what she thinks is going to benefit her the most, and it was really thought-provoking. I thought it was fascinating. I gave it 4 stars. I don't know whether I would agree with this being a thriller. I don't think it's necessarily being marketed as a thriller, but a lot of the quotes that I've seen have described it as being very thrilling. I felt like it had more of an underlying tension that kind of raises to a crescendo, and the last chapter I did think was very gripping. Next up we have The Catch by Amy Lea. This is a romance that follows a main character who is a fashion influencer. She, at the start of the book, is invited to review a hotel in Canada. However, when she shows up, she finds that there's been a mistake and they've booked the wrong dates. So she has to hire a car and books the first Airbnb that has availability, which is over an hour away. She ends up in this small seaside town, this fishing community, where the inn's owner of the Airbnb where she's staying is a grumpy fisherman with some family family issues, and yeah, his family have been arguing for years about this inn, and she ends up it sounds really contrived, she ends up agreeing to fake date him because it seems like an opportunity to bring his family back together. You do kind of have to roll with it. It's not the most realistic, but I thought this was fun. It felt like a rom-com movie, and I love it when romance books give me that feeling, because I do also, as well as I enjoy reading romance books, I enjoy watching romance movies. I thought it was really sweet seeing this main character be welcomed into this family after she's been alone for a while. She has a very close circle of friends. She only has 2 friends who are the main characters from the first 2 books in this series, because this is a series of romance companion novels. She has those 2 close friends, and then she has her younger brother who is her only family. She also feels like her career isn't going that well at the moment because she's been losing sponsorships. Brands feel like her content has stagnated, and there's an aspect of her learning. She doesn't have to put on a persona online. She can be her true self. So I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed the first half, but there were some spicy scenes in the second half that I felt weren't really contributing to the romance anymore. I like spice in romance books, but after 1 or 2 scenes, I start to think, okay, can we get to the point now? This is starting to drag. I want the spicy scenes to contribute to developing the relationship, and when it's no longer doing that, I get bored. I would recommend this series though. The first book is called Set on You, which I thought was just okay. I gave it 3 stars. The second book, X's and O's, follows a book influencer. The first book follows a fitness influencer, and then this obviously follows a fashion influencer. That does bring us to my favourite book of the month and my favourite book of the year so far, which is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden, I think is how you pronounce the author's name. This, like I said, is my favourite book that I've read so far this year. It won the Women's Prize for Fiction last year, and it is a beautifully written book. From the very first chapter, I thought, okay, wow, this is some of the best character work that I've read in a really long time. It's set in the early 1960s in the Netherlands, and it follows a main character called Isabel, who is in her late 20s, and she has lived alone ever since her mom passed away a few years ago, and that's how she likes it. She does prefer her own company. She has 2 brothers, one older and one younger, and the first chapter is her meeting them for dinner, except her older brother brings his new girlfriend with him, which is something that he's done in the past, and Isabel is fed up of it happening. She immediately dislikes this woman. You know when you're reading such a small scene, but there is so much tension underlying, and just the dialogue. The characters speak to each other in quite a formal way. It reminded me of a lot of old movies from that time. I don't know whether people actually spoke like that back then, but there is a formality to the way that they talk to one another. And oh, yeah, even just from that first scene, I was hooked. A few days after this, Isabel receives a call from her brother asking if his girlfriend Eva can come and stay with Isabel while he goes to England for work. And Isabel immediately says no, absolutely not going to happen. But she does end up relenting, and this woman comes to stay with her for a few months, and it is about their relationship. It's about the growing tension between them. Isabel is such a well-written character. She comes across as very uptight, and she does like to keep to herself. She becomes fixated on things very easily. For example, she's convinced that the maid is stealing from her. She lives a very quiet life alone, and she doesn't like the idea of anything upsetting her routine. Eva, on the other hand, is the opposite of Isabel. She has bleached blonde hair, she wears red lipstick, she commands attention, but you still get the impression that there's some sadness bubbling under the surface. And getting to know these 2 women and seeing them together, I can't even explain it because the plot feels very mundane, but the atmosphere is just incredible. It follows the changing of the seasons, and I felt like there was such an attention to detail in describing the characters' clothing, the weather, that made me feel really grounded in that setting. It's a book about love, and it's a book about learning to trust, and I think if you love sapphic books, if you like historical fiction, then this, in my opinion, is a must read. On that note, we're gonna wrap up this reading wrap up, so thank you for watching. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Let me know your favourite or least favourite book of the month or the year so far. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Click subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye.